Welcome to the third season of Between the Lines, the podcast that brings you interviews with some lesser-known Canadian authors and writers. In this season, we will be exploring some of the works of these unknown but talented poets from various locations across this great country. From the breathtaking landscapes of the far north to the bustling downtown city streets, these writers have captured the essence of Canada in their words. In each episode, we will delve into the lives and careers of these fascinating individuals, learning about their inspirations, challenges, and their triumphs. So join us as we discover the hidden gems of Canadian literature and uncover the stories between the lines.
Hello and welcome to Between the Lines. On today's show, I will be speaking with Felicia Kearse, author of When Words Flow, a cluster of poems and notes from a woman and seeker of life. Hello, Felicia, and welcome to Between the Lines.
Thank you so much for having me. I feel pleasure to come here and arrive to your circle of listeners and yourself.
Well, I do get a kick out of what I do and who I do it for, so I guess before we get into the nitty-gritty of the whole interview affair, I wonder if you'd mind giving us listeners, I'm a listener, a brief rundown of who Felicia is and what she's about.
I'd love to. That's such a complex question to ask an individual who has a consciousness. I would say that I have a wandering heart that truly ignites an interest in many forms of art. So I have a history of being a dancer, singer-songwriter, what else? My goodness, visual arts. And I have a family history of ranges of arts that I was influenced by. So art is a big indicator of my life. I'm also an enjoyer of nature. So I do many playful acts such as hiking and biking. And I do live in the surfing hub of Canada, so I take my tries in surfing as well. I'm a yoga teacher and meditation mentor, and I usually help people overcome their psychological, physiological hurdles and be able to self-realize themselves. And these are only a few, but I feel that they're the most important to tell you about.
That's fair enough. Well, thanks for sharing that. Normally, at this juncture I would go right into what I call question period, but the emphasis of this season is Canadian poets and their poetry. And so with that being said, I think now would be a good opportunity for you to present a poem if you have one ready for us.
Absolutely. Would you like an intro or outro of the poem?
Yes.
Okay.
And you know what? We're not limited by time.
All right. So as a way to describe this piece, we often feel desensitized by just the simple pleasures of life. And there was a moment where I was teaching at a resort, and we're just surrounded by the beautiful Nahatlatch River. And it was so serene because it was just me and a few friends that had this beautiful, huge landscape to ourselves. There wasn't tourists in a way. It's really not a well-known area to begin with tourism, so it gave us the pleasures to have this whole beautiful scenery to ourselves. And I just thought, wow, this is just so simple, but yet there's so much content within my heart and the sense of wonderment. So I kind of made, because it was such a simple encounter, I made this piece quite a simple piece as well to reinforce that feeling. So I'll share it now. There, right there, is a creation that is deeply touching. A creation so surreal that your mind doesn't want to acknowledge it. And here it is, all to ourselves. We're only us amongst its waters. We're only the sound of our voice, the ducks, and our paddles tapping the water, echoing through one valley to another. no other human but us. Only ripples of our movement touching the motion of the still waters, viewing the depths and layers of endless mountains. There, right there, is a creation that was made for us in that moment.
Very nice. As you were reading, I was listening, which is what I should have been doing. So good to know I'm still following. And imagery. You were able to plant imagery in my mind with your words, which I find very important. And so I was able to follow along and argue at the same time because, and arguing because I think there was something in there about the echo of a duck.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
A duck's quack doesn't echo. Did you know that?
Interesting. Yeah. But it definitely, because it was such a beautiful area where any and all things were being rippled sound-wise through the valleys.
Hmm.
And it was such a quaint area. There was no other noise, and I could hear only the ducks and the paddles and just the little voices when anytime that we would communicate with each other from afar on the lake. And yeah, just describing that feeling, that sensation of what it felt like to be there.
Yep. I've been to many such places, physically and in my mind. It's true. What can I say? Thanks for sharing that. Now let's move into question period.
Perfect.
We'll start with right at the beginning, number 1. When you write, do you stick to a certain topic or theme, love, nature, death, or do you just write what comes out?
I would say the latter. I see myself often as a conduit to the emotion that's kind of roaming through me, and I just express that outside of me. So it always determines a result that's really diverse from the previous or the future pieces that I make. So whatever tone I find myself anchoring in, even emotionally, it can really alter the type of theme of writing that I do. So I have pieces of nature. I have metaphoric emphasis to really bring about a message forward. I have sensations of love and also heartbreak and moodiness and then wonderment often. However, what I can say would be the continuous theme between each of these pieces that reoccurs time here and there is that each piece converts into an inspirational ending. So it would start with something and then there's an inspirational ending piece to conclude the insight of that moment or that experience. So almost kind of portraying the resiliency that the human experience has, I would say.
So the moment of writing is not necessarily inspired by the moment you're in.
Not often. Like there could be a sense of emotion that I feel in that moment, and then suddenly there would be a channel that goes through me and it expresses the details and description in a way where it kind of brings me to another type of experience. And then I kind of just portray those two experiences into one. So there's a lot of pieces that are a little bit, indicating metaphors. And I'll say that'll be the reason why. And yeah, it's interesting. And sometimes I have a secondary inspiration. So if I'm surrounded by something like music, that can further portray an emotion that seeds out and blossoms into a whole new message.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say, yeah, it just feels as if there's a ongoing channel going through me sometimes. And I don't even have to think about what I need to write. It just kind of comes out as it does. And then, yeah, it just evolves into an array of different themes such as heartbreak or wonderment and cheeriness and reflection.
So you say it, so it just comes out of you out of nowhere. But when you run out of that inspiration to write, that doesn't necessarily mean that whatever you're writing is over. It's just that that particular inspiration is done. Do you come back to it later, or do you let it sit, or what do you do? How do you manage that?
Not often. I feel when there's a piece that comes to an ending that may seem shortened, I feel that that's kind of life telling me that I don't need to elaborate any longer. It's there. The message is direct. We don't have to go further into it. There are a few pieces where I've gone back because I want to have a different perspective upon it, perhaps time later.
Mm-hmm.
But often if a piece ends and it may seem like it's a short piece of art, I'm okay with that. I kind of accept it and just see that it's meant to be that way.
So I write similarly. I get hit by the urge to write. I write till there's nothing done, and I go back through it. And if it doesn't seem complete though, I don't try to force anything into it because it will sound contrived as opposed to the flow that you had. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm not one to really be a forcing nature to begin with when it comes to my artistic endeavors. I just have a feeling that that's the whole forcing attribute that we put amongst ourselves as humans. It's just kind of reinforcing the struggle that and criticism that we have towards ourselves. So I also feel though that forcing can actually create more of a hurdle than anything else. And the whole point of poetry is to get anchor into your feelings and your emotions, and every sense of your being. And if we have the restricting thought process kind of forcing our way through, it creates this log that just falls upon your stream to be able to have this creative flow. So I'm completely supportive of your process because I see it in the same way for myself as well.
I don't know if it's really a process though. It's just a thing, right? It just happens.
It does.
Processes usually involve steps. And with writing this way, it just happens. There's no thinking about it. It's, it's like a wind just coming and going.
Yeah. I would say that the process aspect of that would be just the steps of surrendering.
Okay. That's fair enough.
Yeah.
Number 2, who introduced you to poetry and with what?
I wouldn't say it was a particular person or event or thing. It was kind of a magnitude of things that slowly accumulate into my connection with writing. So I have a few memories to mind that I can share right now that I think were primal steps to get there.
The microphone is yours.
Perfect. Thank you. So for me, since a young child, since I started writing, I would always have pages filled with doodle drawings and just random bits of words. And through that motion, it slowly continued into writing short stories, fictional stories to be exact, and then lyric writing, so songwriting. And the motion of that type of writing with my connection with the paper is what brought me to where I am now with my relationship with my writing, I would say. However, there are a few things that definitely helped me propel a bit more. As any millennial, as I am from that generation, I would say Rumi would be someone that always was in my surroundings. And I really liked his pieces because they felt very aligning to me at any point in time of my life. And I would say that he's very gravitational, deeply insightful and philosophical, and I'm really into philosophical things, but in such an extreme clearness that really speaks loudly into the mind, which I feel sometimes could be hard to do as a writer, depending on the type of writer that you are. And I guess in a lot of ways, I look up to him as a legacy. And another thing that I took pleasure in since a young child was classical civilizations. And with my English studies and classical civilization studies, we learned a lot about literary works in Greece, and other beautiful ancient civilizations. And so a lot of those literary figures really prompted my likeness as well to the philosophical writings. And although I wouldn't say that this is particularly a poetry form, ancient mythologies and the amount of symbolism that they carry and metaphors that they carry into their stories was really reinforcing an interest in using such things in my own everyday creation as well. So I think that all these together is what really prompted my likeness to connect with poetry.
That's fair enough. So basically no living person introduced you to poetry,
No.
reading poetry.
No, and it's so odd because often that's what happens to most poets. Usually someone who is in a very specific category that they start to write in were influenced by a person sometime or another earlier in their age, in their years, who was in that very category of writing. And it seems that I accumulated interest from other things that brought me somehow to the branching of poetry. And it's very interesting for me because anytime I've listened to podcasts of other people or read articles of other people being interviewed, it seems that they were highly influenced by a very particular person in that very specific form of writing. But that didn't necessarily happen to me.
You're one of the lucky ones. I'm kidding. So what about, there was no introduction to writing. That was just something you started doing as well.
Yeah, even before I knew what I was doing, I was always writing random bits and pieces as I was learning to write, not knowing that it would later on form into this infatuation of writing. And also too, at an early age, I would write very heavy, complex storylines for short stories I would write that was not at all affiliated with homeschool work. It was just kind of, I had this really deep imagination, very specific psychological encounters of characters that weren't real in this life, and somehow I developed them in my mind and I would write about them. So at first, obviously, it was fictional writing, and this was before I knew that writing was a form of a position, a role in life, because at that time I didn't know. I was very young. I was literally in kindergarten or I think grade 2 is when we start to write. So it was around that time period. And yeah, I would write very complex, heavy things. And it's really interesting because although I had that attribute kind of naturally occur for me, I also was struggling with something by society, and that was a learning disability when I was much younger. So here I would write an amount of these beautiful stories that were very complex for such a young mind, and yet I was hurdled by the institution with a learning disability. I had this contrast, and it was really interesting as I look back of how I developed. Where did it even come from, And however, there are sides to my mom's side that are writers and visual artists and musicians. So I kind of see how that naturally occurred for me. But it's just such an interesting contrast that I had at an early age. And yeah, it just came naturally to me, the writing process.
I have a lot of teacher friends, so teachers don't beat me up, email me or anything, okay? But I think a lot of the educators I find that label children are doing it because they don't want to face the reality that they might not be able to teach this kid the way he needs to be taught, and just throws a label on it.
Right.
That's been theory.
Absolutely. And especially in the 90s, it was more pronounced, I feel, because there wasn't a whole lot of students that were in a learning disability category. So there was a handful of students through the whole school that would be placed into a separate room away from their grade school classrooms. And it made it very noticeable and also a huge target for bullying. So that's where I came and arrived from, is from that foundation of what I went through. That was quite a hurdle. However, I think in this generation, the newer generations now that are in school, learning disabilities have actually increased. There's an inflation. And so now it's kind of, I feel, incorporated to a bigger capacity than what was available at my time in the early 90s. And many times I encounter parents and their children, and every single time these children are encountered by some sort of learning disability, whether it's autism or, just an array of things.
Well, we won't get into the theory behind that.
No, for sure not. But it seems as if there is a huge increase, a wave of students with learning disabilities. So I think the capacity of being able to approach that is a lot more than what was available at my time, whereas it was more visible for a student like me to be a target of being bullied because I was the outsider. So yeah, it's an interesting concept. However, as any child, we all have a great ability inside of us. It doesn't mean that we're not smart. It doesn't mean that we're stupid. It just means that we have a certain ability that the society isn't able to really approach it in such a way.
If I were to apply the way that I was back in school to today's standards, I probably would have fallen under one of these new labels. But I don't believe, we can try and fact check this if we want, but I don't believe that I had a learning disability. I had a living disability. Mm-hmm. And by that, I mean, a dysfunctional family, step parents, that whole dynamic messes a kid up too. And it's not necessarily a learning disability. It's just a living disability. And again, tied in with, teachers not knowing how to teach to that kind of individual. And they just bump it off to the system, which is an easy escape for them as well. I love you, teachers.
Yes, we love you. We do. There is an importance to education in our life, but yeah, it's interesting. I liked how you said the living stance, because that's what most often happens, is that it's coming from an awful living situation or a difficult living situation that really deters the development of that child. And not just intellectually, but I think also in a social aspect as well.
100%. Absolutely.
And I definitely was a part of that. But it's so interesting because the learning disability that I was labeled to have at the time no longer exists. It was called articulate language disorder.
And it just disappeared.
It just disappeared. At some point, they kind of eliminated that label in the learning disability category. But it was very prominent at the time, and so I would have speech therapists and other type of therapies done as a child. And yeah, no longer. It's interesting because I remember I was reading an article about it because I was intrigued to know when they removed it from the system, and I think it was sometime after my childhood that they eliminated it in the early 2000s or late 2000s, I believe. For those who are that knows more about this, please correct us. But yeah, so it's really interesting how the institution, first of all, the teacher's not paid enough or not given enough requirements to even approach a child, and I mean a spectrum of children with many different learning disabilities or impairments. So I feel that in a way, it's kind of hard for us to just give fault to the teachers when they're not getting paid enough and they don't have the requirements or the credentials to deal with the psychological upbringings of a child that affects their way of learning. I think that the whole point of just a teacher is just to teach the general information of all these subjects that we learn. So I think that's also a problem within our society is not giving enough credentials or engagement in knowing, the possibilities of different types of children and their way of learning.
I think you just came up with about 40 or 50 different topics to write poetry about. If you were inspired by that, email me and let me know. When you first started writing poetry, were you show it to everybody kind of writer, or were you the keep it to yourself?
I love this question because as we were just talking about learning disabilities, I kept it to myself because I was afraid to show how my thoughts were like. Growing up with what I did at the time, it made me feel as if I wasn't suitable to share my thoughts. I wasn't suitable to share my voice because it wasn't strong enough to do so. So for me, my writing was, for the most part, hidden. However, there would be very few friends I would actually share it to that were very encouraging and saw the grand abilities within me to share it to them. But there were very few. So either between my short stories, my songwriting, and also some poetry pieces as well at the time. But it wasn't until 2016 when I would say, completely transformed from yoga, as I'm a yoga teacher. I went through a very heavy, deep integration process of doing a year of studying under a Hindu and Vedic priest, getting deep into scriptural yoga, as well as the physical aspect, and implementing it very heavily into my everyday routine. And it really changed and altered me in a way that felt more courageous and more articulate, which gave me the confidence to start sharing my pieces. I was not fairly new to Instagram. I think by then I was a couple years into having Instagram, and I would start to post a really beautiful photo, and along that photo was a caption that was a piece of mine, a poetry piece or a prose piece. And I would have it alongside that photo. And interesting enough, people in an unforeseen matter were heavily complimenting on that written piece rather than the photo itself, which I thought, okay, maybe this is important, the writing aspect. And I started to share it more and more, and people complimented and complimented more and more, which progressed into my choices later on in choosing to publish later on the path, which I did. If it wasn't for just simply having the courage to just start sharing and receiving that reward of people appreciating those little prose pieces or poetry pieces, I wouldn't be where I am now, being a published author.
Can you read another poem for us?
Sure. So this one is kind of implementing a metaphor to a meaning that I felt I wanted to reveal. And it was about having to accept the darkness. And there's a reason to darkness. It's actually a nourishing process to how we grow. And so it's just a little piece. It's quite small, but I feel that it's profound because as you were sharing about the piece that, you kept to yourself and then it was shown, but someone found it and they read it. This very piece actually was read by someone unexpectedly as well. I had posted it on the social media, and days after I went to a women's circle. And in this women's circles, there was mutual friends and then also acquaintances at the time, and all of whom I had on my Facebook. So I guess they were able to see this on either platform, Facebook or Instagram. And we began the circle by introducing ourselves and why we're here. And sometimes we bring something to the center as a centerpiece of our ritual. And this woman suddenly said, I hope whoever in the circle is okay that I read this because it's her piece. And she read this very piece I'm about to say.
Uh-oh.
And it was, honestly, Randy, I want to cry. Watching someone else feel deeply connected to a piece that's not even a length, it's quite a short piece, but feel something to the point that they want to introduce that piece into the circle was the most exhilarating thing I could feel. And that was another indication as to why I felt it was important to publish my book. So this is the piece that was read by someone else unexpectedly into a circle. In order for life to blossom in the night. The darkness shall be the nourishing of the sprouting. For without the dampened and dark soil, the roots, visible in the light, will wither, hindering any life from growing.
Oh yeah, that's kind of deep. Actually, no, it is pretty deep. What's it mean to you?
For me, it was about accepting the hardships that we go through as sort of a medicine and nourishment to grow from. And as icky as it is to be there, there's always a lesson to be learned there. There's always something insightful to gain there that makes you this courageous being to blossom and grow from. So for me, it was a lot about showcasing that emotion and seeing it in a visual metaphor with nature, that is. You know, every time I see that little piece, it's quite small of a piece, but somehow every time I read that, I think, firstly, that came from me. Damn. It's pretty good. And secondly, you know, if I still continue to feel this way, then perhaps someone else that reads it will feel the same way as well, which will weave our souls together in a sense. And yeah, so that's what it does for me.
You just, reminded me of a quote that, my own quote that I put in a few of my books. And it basically goes something along the lines of this. I do not necessarily write because I have something to say, but rather because there may be something you need to hear.
I love that.
Use it. I don't own it. I created it, but I share it and go ahead. Whatever. That's truly what I believe though.
Yeah, absolutely.
And as sometimes as ridiculous as it may sound to me or, whatever, or somebody's going to get something out of it.
Absolutely.
And if we don't share it, then we're failing in our duty.
Yeah, it's deservicing the whole of life, I feel. And every person that's involved into this life that we live, I feel the whole point of artistry of any kind is to share it, to be able to connect to someone and feel that connection as we're meant to birth to be, as we're meant to be connected individuals, species. And we've been living in a society where there's lots of corruption and pain and trauma that can really, truly cut the bonds between each other.
Absolutely. Before we actually started this interview, I think I said, nothing happens by chance. So maybe her reading that in that circle had to have a reason, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Next question. Who do you write for? What a tie-in.
What a tie-in. I was just about to say, firstly, what I unleash as a message comes from the depths of myself, needing to be brought to the forefront as a way to find a deep bond within myself. Rather, that's the higher, grander state of my being to, the universe, God, whoever we want to identify, the higher power, but also sometimes the consciousness of the younger me, inner work, talking to that little girl inside that still feels defeated at times. And, but in the process of doing that and then making my work more public, then it becomes an aim in writing and projecting the same way as it does for me to that other person. It's reaching towards the heart of another person to create that bond. Even if we're afar from each other, we don't know each other in a conscious level, but there's this level within ourselves that are deeply connected. And that's all that truly matters to me with writing. So kind of tying in back to the beautiful quote that you shared.
It does tie in, doesn't it? But you know what? You chose these questions.
Some of it was meant to be. Absolutely. The transition.
Is poetry dying? Or do you think that there is still enough interest in to keep writing it?
Yeah. I personally don't feel so. I feel that any form of art, whether it's poetry, music, dance, whatever you may see art as, will never decay. I feel that it only changes and grows. The evolvement of poetry will certainly branch out, as I'm already witnessing to this day. And truthfully, I view myself a part of it because I am of a younger generation. And now with the rising of prose poetry, I feel that that's a new branch of art form within the poetry sector that may not be wholly accepted yet into the poetry community,
Mm-hmm.
but I do see it branching out. And obviously, because I'm of the millennial generation, there's new forms of poetry that are coming out, but I don't think, in my perspective, from what I can foresee in the future, in myself, I don't see poetry ever decaying. I think that there will be new introductions of genres and styles. And truthfully, older forms of art will always come back because we live in a regurgitated society. So things are always going to come back into style, with any, such as fashion. The 90s back in fashion. It's crazy.
The mullet.
Yeah, I tried to run away from the fashions of the 90s, and now I'm surrounded by the 90s in Tofino. So I feel that any form of poetry will come back at some point in the future if it seems like they're kind of fading out. However, I don't feel that poetry is dying whatsoever.
Okay, that's fair enough. But the other side of that question, which I'm glad you picked up on this side of it, but the other side is if you go back to like the 1600s, the Renaissance, and poetry was at its height in culture. You know what I mean? Everything, poetry was the thing to be doing, and as painting as well. But and then poetry started declining in popularity. And then through the 60s, it came back up again, and I missed a whole bunch there, but the 60s was big on poetry. And I think now we're in a lull to the point where, it almost seemed like, there were so many, I don't read poetry. Poetry is not my thing or whatever. And yes, there is now a new resurgence coming, but it hasn't peaked yet, I don't think.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I could see it rising. I think, just from the time that I've lived here on Earth, poetry wasn't really, at the time of my early years, wasn't really an amusement as it is now compared to my youth. I feel that poetry is now more of an amusement than it was when I was much younger. So in that sense, I see it kind of rising back up, and that's why I say I don't see decaying. I just see it, things coming back into life here and there as a fluctuating stream. And I think it may rise more from here on, even so, because we have so many great thinkers that are coming back to life.
Mm-hmm.
Thinkers that are very deeply philosophical. And I feel that the more their name is heard, which could be very easy to do in this day and time because we have social media as a way to flare that up, I feel that poetry will definitely rise back up. I've never read this person's poetry before, but in my generation, she's becoming quite a popular one. And that's, Rupi. No, her name's Rupi Kaur. Yes, Rupi Kaur. I had to second guess myself.
That's a good thing sometimes.
Yes. Yeah, Rupi Kaur, I haven't read her works yet. However, I see people posting her pieces through social media. And not only that, she does poetry performances. She's making a comeback of the importance of poetry performances. And I feel that that's kind of like the Renaissance time where it was, you would go there and someone would speak poetry in front of a crowd. And that's kind of coming back into normality right now. With her, I feel, as a Canadian poet, and activist. So I do see poetry rising back up. In my community here, there is a huge group of poets, young and aged, and we really feel that there's a great importance in sharing it. So there's spoken word is quite a popularity. So I feel from one town to another, it will slowly rise back up into introducing the amusement of poetry performance and just digging back deeply into translating someone else's perspective into the means of your own consciousness.
But that's the West Coast. So if it's not Tofino, it's Bowen Island, it's Gabriola Island. You know what I'm trying to say, right? That's
Okay.
just the way the West Coast has gone, the West Coast of Canada has gone, is all the thinkers and freedom. I don't even know what I'm trying to say, but those type of people, and I was one of them because I lived out there for many, many years, but that they seem to gravitate to the West Coast of Canada or Toronto.
That's a really interesting thing that you just brought up. Thank you. Yes, actually, as we observe this, I do feel that there's certain hubs of society that definitely welcome it more than others. And it's dependent on how we live. I feel here in most parts of BC, that is, especially in the remote areas, they're very welcoming to slow-paced life, which welcomes an intensity of your thoughts, dwelling into your own thoughts and your emotions that can really ripple out into these beautiful art forms of art. Whereas in the city, it's a fast-paced lifestyle or even in the suburban area, and all that's thought of is money. All that's thought of is accomplishing to a certain entitlement in life, a position. For that reason, it really desensitizes a person from being into the heart of their soul, which is artistry. That's where artistry is birthed from, is from our souls, I feel. Mm-hmm. So I absolutely, from when you said that, I can definitely see that for sure. That is a truth for sure.
Well, there you have it, folks. You've heard it right here. I'm smarter than I look, but dumber than you think. But with regards to the city thing, yeah, it's fast paced, but you know what? They don't want to waste their time on things that they perceive as being a waste of time, such as creativity or anything like that. They're too focused on getting done what needs to be done, and they don't have the time for anything else. Yeah. Is that a fair assessment?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
All right. I'm feeling accomplished now. What are the benefits and challenges, for that matter, with self-publishing a book of poetry?
When I chose my route of author-subsidized publishing, it was for the favor of owning the rights of my work, along with full monetary reward of what sells of my poetry. Whereas
it's starting to sound like a city folk there.
Yeah. Well, it means normally, from what I've heard from many people that have gone the traditional publishing route, they've lost their control over their own artistry, and suddenly the credit is going to the publishing agency. And I don't think that's fair for an artist, especially because art in itself, it's really hard to make it into the world as an artist to begin with. And I don't see there being a benefit from someone else owning the rights to my work and benefiting off of it when it's my vulnerability to begin with to share these pieces of my own that came from me, and suddenly having someone else get credited for it, even through monetary gain. So I feel I chose author subsidizing. Another challenge that would be for going the self-publishing route would obviously be the marketing aspect. With a traditional publishing industry, obviously there's a greater capacity.
Sorry.
That's okay. Of visibility, right? There's more visibility when you're going through traditional publishing, whereas with self-publishing, it's mainly on your own to make yourself be known in whatever capacity you can reach. And so, for instance, with big retailer bookstores, they're not just going to automatically have your book in store, whereas traditional publishing, it's more accessible to do that. I have to do a great portion of work to get my book on the shelves of stores, which take a lot of time and effort. As those who are listening in that knows this complication would definitely feel that in the depths themselves. And so I would say those are the challenges and the benefits of either or. But the main aspect as to why I chose to go the self-publishing route was because I want to own the rights of my work. I don't want my work to be stolen off of my heart, off of my soul. And it was greatly important to have full control over it.
I can understand that. I don't know if this happens as much in poetry world, but with fiction and other memoirs and whatever, you send it into the publisher and they, well, we want this changed, we want that changed, we want this. At what point does that story stop being yours? Do you think that's a relevant statement with regards to poetry?
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Between the Lines. We hope you enjoyed our discussion and were inspired to either start writing or to keep on writing. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for future episodes or guests, you can reach out to us by sending an email to randy.btlpodcast@gmail.com. Use comment or suggestion in the subject line. For a copy of the transcript of this or any other episode, just send us an email using transcript as the subject line and indicate which season and episode you would like a transcript for. Visit my website, therandylacey.ca, where you can purchase one of my books, read my blog, and yes, even hear every episode of this podcast. If you have enjoyed what you've heard and would like to hear more, click the Buy Me a Coffee button at the top right corner of the page to help cover the costs associated with keeping this show available to you. If you're ever feeling overwhelmed by the many lines in your life, take a deep breath and remember the wise words of Winnie the Pooh. Sometimes the smallest things take up the most room in your heart. Until next time, keep on keeping between the lines.
You have been listening to part 1 of our interview with the incredibly talented Felicia Kearse. Before we wrap up, we have a very important announcement to make. Between the Lines will be taking the entire month of June off to prepare for the remainder of Season 3. We'll be back on July 5th with the conclusion of our interview with Felicia and even more amazing content. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe to the show on whichever platform you listen to us on. By subscribing, you'll receive reminders and notifications of any new content we release, including surprise bonus episodes. We also want to take a moment to thank our listeners for their support. If you enjoy the show, please consider supporting us by buying us a coffee or two. Your support helps offset the cost of running the show and will even help us upgrade and replace some of our equipment so that we can continue to deliver a high-quality podcast. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you on July 5th for the rest of Season 3 of Between the Lines.